You can go ahead, no problem.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here. This is Dawn Richards speaking from Clinical Trials Ontario, and I'm going to tell you a bit about the basics of clinical trials. So to start off with, a brief agenda, I'm going to tell you first a little bit about my organization, Clinical Trials Ontario. We'll move into what clinical trials are, and then we'll talk a little bit about, if you're interested in looking for a trial, some of the things you might do to help you out. So first of all, Clinical Trials Ontario is supported by the Ontario Ministry of Economic Development, Job Creation and Trade. Our vision is to make Ontario a preferred location for global clinical trials while maintaining the highest ethical standards. And our mission is to strengthen, promote, and capitalize on Ontario's competitive advantages to conduct high-quality clinical trials. So what this all really means is we're about helping improve the environment within Ontario for clinical trials. And we do that through 3 strategic pillars. The first strategic pillar is streamline, and that's really about helping organizations and people who do clinical trials to streamline the processes behind clinical trials, allowing us to support timely, efficient, and cost-effective conduct of high-quality clinical trials. A lot of work we've done in this area has been around streamlining the Research Ethics Board approval process for multi-center clinical trials, and we've also been doing some work in other areas of streamlining as well. Our second strategic pillar is an engagement pillar, and that means supporting and promoting both public and patient engagement with clinical trials. So engage isn't only about encouraging participation in clinical trials, but it's also about supporting a broader dialogue about clinical trials and about why they're important for health and healthcare, and it's about raising general awareness. It's also about recognizing and seeing the importance that patient partners bring to clinical trials teams in the case of informing and helping better design studies. Our last strategic pillar is promote, and this is about promoting Ontario's competitive advantages and our clinical trial capacities to attract more industry investment. So a large number of clinical trials that happen in Canada do happen in Ontario. And as I've mentioned before, that plays significantly into our health and healthcare within Ontario. We're going to talk a little bit about that as well. I also want to mention that while we are an Ontario-based organization, everything that I'm going to talk about today does apply on a national scale. So nothing that I'm going to talk about is specific to Ontario. So for those of you who are joining from outside of Ontario, the content that we'll discuss definitely applies to your situations as well. Briefly, this is our website. And we've just released a new website as of a couple of months ago. On the very right-hand side of the screen, you'll see that we do have a lot of information now for patients and the public. A lot of what I'm going to talk about today is under the first sub-tab called Learn More About Clinical Trials. And I'll also be talking about finding a clinical trial. I wanted to let you know too that everything under this specific tab has been developed in close consultation and with guidance and input from our patient partners through our Patient and Public Advisory Group, through organizations like the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network and other patient organizations, as well as health charities. So we've spent a lot of time listening, understanding what is needed, and building that information into the website, and specifically the section that we've created for patients and the public. Again, under that particular section of the website, the Learn More About Clinical Trials tab looks like what you see on the screen. And so I'm really going to be talking about the first couple of chevrons there on the diagram. And you can see that we've set this up, so it really depends on where you are in your clinical trial decision-making process, that the site's been set up so that you can really target in to the information that you'd like to learn about and the information that's most relevant to where your headspace is, quite frankly, about clinical trials. So let's start off with what clinical trials are. They are a type of research, and they are a type of research that involves people. Clinical trials are set up to test health-related interventions. I'm going to come back to what those interventions may be. And clinical trials will often answer questions like, is the intervention safe? Does the intervention improve or cure disease or help people live longer with the disease than other treatments that are currently available? And does the intervention help people feel better? So you might often hear the term quality of life. And this last point is about, helping people do the types of things that are important to them every day. So let's go back to what interventions may be. So health interventions are studied in clinical trials. And in clinical trials, we're looking at so-called interventions or treatments on their own, or maybe in combination with others. And we often think of interventions being drugs. I think we often associate clinical trials with testing drugs, but they actually can test a lot of other things as well. So that might include some type of medical device. Maybe that's a pump, maybe that would be a pacemaker, maybe a type of surgery, maybe a type of radiation therapy, could be a diagnostic procedure, and it could be things like diet and lifestyle. So maybe a particular diet within a certain population, or maybe an exercise program within a certain group of individuals as well. So just to let you know that clinical trials are more than simply testing drugs. They can test a variety of other interventions as well. So why do we do clinical trials at all? Well, we talked about the fact that clinical trials are a type of research, and being a type of research, they aim to provide data associated with that, also called evidence, about the intervention that's being tested. And they really do help us decide what therapies or other interventions might work best in people. So sometimes we think of clinical trials from a very personal point of view about, how might they help me, or what might my risks be being a participant. But it's also important to know that the data from clinical trials can be used on a much broader scale than just the individual participant as well. So we really find out safety information here through clinical trials and the data they provide, whether or not to continue testing interventions. Results might be used by companies as they develop new therapies or new devices. Results can help both doctors and other healthcare professionals within their daily practices and how they treat patients. The results might help regulatory agencies in terms of which drugs or devices are the most safe and effective. And they also help government and policymakers with respect to resource allocation in health and healthcare. So, there can be really individual decisions that are made based on clinical trials, and then we can go to very macro decisions that can be made based on the results of clinical trials as well. So a lot of people are interested in deciding, how do I know if a clinical trial is reputable or credible? So we've got a few things here that you should look for when you're thinking of a clinical trial. So one of the things you might ask, are all the costs of the clinical trial covered? For example, are the study treatments covered? Are any tests covered? you shouldn't be asked to pay a participant fee to be part of a study, and things like study treatments and tests should be covered. You may have to pay some out-of-pocket expenses, for example, for transportation to get maybe to appointments that are part of the clinical trial. Maybe there's parking fees associated with it. Some of those smaller costs you might need to pay for. What are the qualifications of the clinical trial team? So you might take a look and see if the clinical trial team has been, for example, working or studying in this particular area for many years, or maybe they are affiliated with an academic institution or a university that's well known. Has the clinical trial application been reviewed by the regulatory agency? And that agency in Canada is Health Canada. And again, Health Canada is responsible for making sure that things are safe and effective. So they will review clinical trial applications. Has the clinical trial been reviewed and approved by a research ethics board, which you might also hear called an REB? And it's the REB's job to review the clinical trial with respect to ensuring that the proposed conduct and design of the research have considered and applied ethical principles. And lastly, you might ask, was the clinical trial reviewed and approved by the institution or organization where it's taking place? Ultimately, that institution or organization is responsible for what happens on its premises. And these are all questions you can ask about a clinical trial if you're interested in one, and check out to make sure that you're happy with how these questions have been answered. So clinical trials are designed to answer specific health questions, and depending on the question that you're setting out to answer, they're designed differently. So we've got a brief explanation of the different phases of clinical trials here, and I'm just going to go over each one of these in a little bit of detail. So phase 1 clinical trials, this will be the first time that the intervention is in people, and these are smaller studies. They're usually about 20 to 80 people, and this is where they've been designed to examine safety, dose, and side effects of the intervention. Depending on the results of this phase, the intervention may not continue to be studied, or it may continue to be studied. It depends on what the outcome of the phase 1 study is. So phase 2 studies involve larger numbers of people, and this is where we look at whether or not the intervention does what it's actually supposed to do. And there might be some studies here around if the dose needs to change. And again, we're looking at side effects still. Phase 3 studies are quite large studies. They're done in thousands of people, and you may hear them referred to as randomized clinical trials. So this is where you're comparing 2 or more interventions or treatment arms, and this is generally where participants in a randomized clinical trial are assigned by chance to one of the interventions, and that's done so that we reduce the bias in the interpretation of results at the end of the study. In phase 3 studies, we're looking again at how long the effects of the intervention lasts, and we continue to look at potential side effects. Again, at this time in a lot more people. Phase 4 studies, if the intervention makes it to this stage, these are sometimes also called post-marketing surveillance studies. So this is when the intervention has been approved for widespread use or for sale or marketing purposes. And this is when we look at long-term effects in large numbers of people. So again, just to recap, the design of a study will be based on the types of questions that you're seeking to answer and where the intervention is in the research stage as well. So, why might you be interested in a clinical trial? There's a few reasons. You might be living with a condition or a disease, and Anne Marie is going to share her own experiences with me or with you after I provide this presentation about her own experiences and why she decided to participate in clinical trials. You might have a loved one who lives with a condition or disease. Some people, quite frankly, are just interested in research. And sometimes healthy participants are provided compensation to participate. And for some people, this can be a motivator as well. So if you're thinking about a clinical trial, you might think, what are my other options? And this is probably something you'll want to talk over with other people. It might be your healthcare provider or providers. One option is not receiving any treatment. Another option would be receiving standard treatment or a different form of treatment than what you're currently on if you live with a disease or a condition. And your third option is you might wish to participate in a different research study altogether. But I would advise that you talk to your doctor about any potential study that you're interested in, as well as the potential known benefits and risks of any of these options to help you make your decisions. Can you say no to a clinical trial if your healthcare provider offers you one? And yes, you can absolutely say no if you feel the clinical trial isn't the right choice for you. The choice is completely up to you, and it's a voluntary choice that you make. Even if you decide to be in a clinical trial, it doesn't mean that you need to stay in it. You can choose to leave the clinical trial at any time. But it is important for you to know that you don't have to participate if you're approached to potentially consider being in one. And ultimately, your relationship with your healthcare provider should not change, no matter what your decision is about a clinical trial. Now, how would you go about finding a trial? There are a few different ways that I'll talk to you about here, and some of them may be more labor intensive than others. So first, you might just consider talking to your healthcare provider. They may or may not be comfortable with having that type of conversation, and they may feel like their knowledge level is very good about clinical trials or maybe not that good. So that's just something to be aware of. You might wish to ask a health charity or a patient organization. So that's part of why the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network has asked us to provide this webinar today, is to provide you with some information. And they might be able to help you with other information after this webinar as well. You might contact a hospital or an organization that does research. And I'm going to be honest with you, that might involve a few emails or calls depending on who you're able to reach there. You may have seen ads in the newspaper or on TV or heard them on the radio, and obviously those are things you can choose to follow up on as well. And lastly, I'm going to talk just briefly about what we're calling our clinical trial finder. And that's something that we've newly released, and again, might be something for you to think about using if you're interested in finding a clinical trial or just seeing even what's out there. So this is the web address of our clinical trials finder, and you're looking at a screenshot of what it looks like. Again, just to let you know that this has been developed in close collaboration with patients, CTO's Patient and Public Advisory Group, a number of health charities and patient organizations as well. And we've taken their feedback into consideration about kind of the easiest way to go about finding a clinical trial. So on the left-hand side, you'll see a number of drop downs here, areas that you may decide to input or not when you're looking for a study. So the first one is your condition, which chances are you're going to input. The second is location, and just to let you know, by default, the location will search in Ontario, but you can search for a study in any province in Canada. And you may or may not be interested in a specific study phase, and you may or may not choose to enter your demographics. That's things like your biological sex and your age. And after you've entered what you'd like to enter within this left-hand area, you would click on the search button. And what will show up then in this right-hand part of the screen is whatever clinical trials have been found that match your search criteria. And you can go ahead and click on any of those clinical trials, and more information will be provided to you about those studies. That will include any contact information that is available about those clinical trials. So there's a way also to print out the information that you find about particular clinical trials there, and that might be something that you follow up on your own or take in to talk to your healthcare provider. But just to let you know that this is available on our website, and we're always happy to hear feedback as well, given that we've just released it, and we will continue to refine it based on feedback that we get from the community. So the next question to help you out with your search is, how will you know if a clinical trial is a good clinical trial for you? So these are some questions that we've put together, again, based on our consultations with the community. And a number of them are the exact same questions you would ask about a trial being credible or reputable. And if you look at the last question, another thing that you're going to have to meet is something called eligibility criteria for the clinical trial. So even though you might be interested in a particular clinical trial, there will be eligibility criteria. It might be specifics about your condition or your disease. For example, it could be disease activity or the stage, etc. But you will have to make sure that you meet the eligibility criteria to be in the clinical trial. And once you've expressed an interest in a clinical trial, you would be screened to make sure that you meet the eligibility criteria in order to participate. So that is important for people to understand as well. Even though you're interested in a specific clinical trial, you would first have to meet the eligibility criteria in order to participate. So what if you can't find a clinical trial and it's something that you're really interested in? There might be some things that you consider. One, that maybe there's a clinical trial in another location, not exactly where you are, but you could contact the study team in that case and see if it is possible for you to participate. And if it is, how would this affect you? So how far away is it? Would you have to pay for your own travel, or would there be an offset for you? Some of those questions you would have to think about. There may actually be ways to bring the clinical trial closer to you. Some of those may be fairly labor intensive. So maybe there's a clinical trial in another city or province that you're interested in, and it won't be possible for you to travel to be part of it. There may be ways that you can that the clinical trial might be able to open in a center that is closer to you, but chances are that will take a bit of advocacy and potential work for that to actually happen. But it has happened before. Lastly, you might just choose to keep up to date on research and check from time to time on what clinical trials are available in the specific area that you're interested in. Again, I've talked to patients where they've watched research and clinical trials that are happening in the US, and then a few months later, they open up Canadian sites. So it's worth keeping an eye on something if you're interested in it, and it may become available closer to home at another point. So I just wanted to wrap up with reminding you about our website. Um, as I mentioned, there were a couple of sections of Learn More About Clinical Trials that I've presented on here today, but there are more for you to check out if you're interested in continuing to answer other questions about clinical trials for yourself. And next, what I'm going to do is hand it over to Anne-Marie Serrato, and Anne-Marie is going to talk about her experiences being a clinical trial participant, and then Anne-Marie and I are going to take questions together at the end and answer as many questions as we can of yours before we wrap up today. So Anne-Marie, I'm going to pass it over to you now.
Great, thank you so much, Dawn. So my name is Anne-Marie Serrato. I'm a 10-year survivor of incurable lung cancer. I was diagnosed at 30, originally with a treatable stage where I was able to receive chemotherapy, surgery, and radiation, which was standard of care. And for a little while, I had very good health. And then 2 years later, I had a recurrence. And at that point in time, my options became very limited. And so I didn't like the fact that I might die at 32. And so I was very motivated to find something, because the protocol at that time, and I think still is today, is a wait and see sort of way to go, where they just wait until symptoms become symptomatic and they treat them. And that wasn't good enough for me. And so I was looking everywhere, and I happened upon an article talking about a new drug, and that piqued my interest. And so I contacted my medical team with regards to this particular drug and whether or not I would be able to access it. And so they had never heard of it, and did some looking into things and found a clinical trial that was in phase 3 just outside of Toronto, where I'm located. And I was put in contact with one of the leading physicians and saw him. He explained the trial and how it was looking at the new drug versus the standard of care, and that if I was eligible, and the eligibility was really having a particular gene driver, if I was eligible for that, then I would be enrolled in the trial and I would be randomized. And so I kind of left things to him. I went to Italy and had a good time. And 3 weeks later, I heard back, and they said, yes, you have this particular mutation. We're going to enroll you in the trial when you get home, and we will see what happens. And so at the time, they didn't even test my tumor samples here in Toronto, or in Ontario, rather. They had to send them away. And so that caused a little bit of a wait time in terms of being enrolled. But once I was enrolled, I was very quickly randomized. I very quickly received the drug arm of the study. And I was reassured that if I didn't get that new drug, that I would receive standard of care, and if I should progress, then they would automatically give me the new drug. It was a very effective drug, and it gave me 5 years of incredible health. I was able to do a heck of a lot of stuff in those 5 years, like travel the world and start advocating, buy a house, get married, all those things that I never thought I would be able to do. So clinical trials really gave me my life back. In 2016, I progressed again, and I knew of a new drug coming into trial. So my options became taking something that was Health Canada approved, but still not funded in Ontario, and worked really well, or to try this new drug in trial when it came. And so I weighed my options and talked to a lot of people about this new drug, and decided that I would go into clinical trial versus taking something that they knew, because I knew I always had that backup. But that was my personal choice, and it may not be everyone's choice. But clinical trials for the whole, for me, have been a very positive experience. Sure, I've had some side effects from the drug, but any drug has side effects. And so, I kind of go down that list of, well, what do I really want out of life? And if I need to live, so are these side effects really something that affect my life so drastically that I would stop taking them or reduce my dose? Personally, no. So I put up with some of the sort of negative things about new drugs in trials, and that, side effects are one of them, but they typically can be managed very, very effectively. I get scanned a lot, which is a good thing and a bad thing. When you've been in a clinical trial for 8 years of your life, you kind of sometimes think, oh my goodness, do they have to scan me again? But really, when you look at it, it's kind of nice to have that reassurance on a frequent basis, and know that if there was anything going on with my disease, that they'd detect it right away and they would be able to do something about it, hopefully. So those are some of the things you want to weigh. But I know I've heard people say that, oh, I don't want to go into a clinical trial because, I feel like a guinea pig, or they may not give me the drug right away, or they, I might not get drug, I might get a placebo. And I can reassure you that especially in oncology trials, which I am in, they they never have a trial where you would get a placebo. You'd always get standard of care or the new drug. And so for me, I felt like the second time around, it was a conscious choice where I was going to kind of give back a little bit, just in terms of being able to provide data for this drug that will help other people. And so that was part of my decision-making process as well. It's really meant that I could do everything I do today, and be very healthy, live with my disease with a very high quality of life. And it's given me 8 years of life that I probably wouldn't have had without it. So, I mean, I'm grateful for the fact that I was able to find a trial, and that I was able to get into a trial, and have wonderful, wonderful people who led the trial. My medical team is bar none one of the best, and I really like them. They're very personable. They're very knowledgeable, and that's the other benefit to a trial, is sometimes you're exposed to experts in their field, and so they really, really know your disease really, really well, and they have their hand on the pulse of cutting edge technology, cutting edge treatments, and so that is also another benefit to enrolling in a clinical trial, is you get access to those people where you may not have had that before. Sometimes you have to travel, which can sometimes be inconvenient. But again, these are all personal choices that you would want to weigh out before you participate. I have refused parts of the protocol on trials, and still have remained in a trial. And so, you do have freedom. You're not a prisoner. You're not a guinea pig. You're treated with respect. You're treated like a patient. But I think you're treated a little bit better than like the average patient, because you get such personalized care. So I think that too is something that you want to look at. I pay for parking. Unfortunately, I have to pay for parking in downtown Toronto, which is not always pleasant. But I try to put aside some money for that. And sometimes trials will pay for it. So it's good to ask about that kind of thing. And before you ever even enter into the trial, you will have it explained to you in full detail. And if there's anything that you question, that part of it's called informed consent. And if there's any part you question, just ask away. The person that is explaining to you knows the trial really well, and they'll be able to answer your questions. But on the whole, if I was asked today if I would go into another clinical trial, I would say yes every time, because I feel that what I'm doing is benefiting others. I feel like it's giving me access to the sort of the newest, and sometimes the best, and whatever it is that is your motivator, it's your own personal choice, but I would highly recommend looking at a clinical trial as an option, not as a last resort, but as an option. That probably wraps up what I have to say right now. So I will pass it back to Dawn.
Okay, thanks very much, Anne-Marie. I really appreciate you working with me here to share your own experiences while I kind of present the basics about things, because I think it really helps people understand the basics more in terms of how that actually impacts somebody going through this as an experience. So I think I've just put up a slide for questions. I wanted to let people have my email address here as well. If you don't feel comfortable asking a question here, though we're not going to mention any names, you can go ahead and send me an email after the fact. Otherwise, both Anne-Marie and I are happy to take questions if you go ahead and type them into the question box here. I guess maybe, Anne-Marie, I'd like to ask you a question when we get started here.
Sure.
And that would be, did you know anything about clinical trials before your diagnosis, or did someone mention them to you, or did you go ahead and do your own diligence right from the get-go?
Well, to be honest with you, when I came across the article, I had really not, I was pretty ignorant about what a clinical trial was. I had an idea, and it probably was the same idea as most people. Like, we test a drug, they sometimes do them on lab rats. So I was really kind of out there not knowing. And I certainly learned a lot through the first experience I had. But no, I didn't know a lot about clinical trials. I pursued it because it seemed like an option, but I didn't know if it was necessarily the right option for me. And it did turn out to be so.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? I'm not seeing any come up on my my question box right now.
I have them on my end. Do you want me to read them to you?
Sure.
Okay, so the first one is, with the proposed changes coming to healthcare in Ontario, Bill 74, will clinical trials be more limited?
I don't think I have enough information to be able to answer that question. I think that might be something that I can look into, but I don't have enough information to be able to answer that well on this call.
Okay, and then the other one is, can we access clinical trials that are going on in the US?
So yes, you absolutely can find clinical trials that are happening in the US. You can't do that, just so you know, through Clinical Trials Ontario's Clinical Trial Finder, but that may be an option for you, is to talk to your healthcare provider about it, or to access other resources to find studies. Depending on where the study is, again, there's, you're probably going to want to ask a lot of questions about costs and about, for example, costs associated with travel, etc. But I have known a number of individuals who have traveled to the US and other places to be in clinical trials.
Perfect. And then if the researchers are in 4 medical institutions, how many REBs would the trial have to go through?
So sorry, that was if the researchers who are part of the clinical trial are at 4 different institutions, how many
Yes.
REBs? Okay, so in Ontario, with Clinical Trials Ontario's streamlined REB system for multi-center studies, if all of those centers are part of our streamlined ethics review, in Ontario, they would only need to submit 1 ethics review package. In other jurisdictions, they may have to submit up to 4 REB reviews, and that means 4 separate approval processes, usually 4 separate sets of submission documents, etc. But within Ontario, that's a large part of what Clinical Trials Ontario has been working on for a number of years now with the community.
Okay. And how do you populate your clinical trials database?
So Clinical Trials Ontario's Clinical Trials Finder actually uses data that's found in clinicaltrials.gov, which is a database that's hosted by the National Institutes of Health in the United States. And a number of global studies are part of that database. So that's where we pull our data from. And the difference is in how you search it. So we've made the search interface different from if you went to clinicaltrials.gov. And we've also tried to simplify what is returned or how it looks when it's returned when you find a study. So if you've ever searched on clinicaltrials.gov, there's a number of different criteria you can choose to search. We've limited ours quite a bit to what people have told us are probably the most important search criteria. And then the same information is displayed when a clinical trial is found. We've just, in our clinical trial finder, displayed it in a much different way, and it's probably less overwhelming in terms of how we've chosen to display it.
Okay. Are there difficulties in obtaining accurate data from the trials?
That's a tough question. It's a little bit vague. I don't know if I can go back, and maybe that's a question I could take offline and probe a bit more about what people mean by accurate data.
All right, I'll send it to you later.
Okay, perfect.
And then the next one is, are the clinical trial drugs provided free of charge to the participants even after the clinical trial finished in all clinical trials?
So I don't think it's a blanket statement that happens in after all clinical trials are finished. There usually is some form of the ability to provide participants with access to the therapy, and sometimes until approval or until things are negotiated within Canada. But it's not a blanket statement that I think I can say that they are that people can continue on the same medication after each study. I think that's usually fairly trial dependent, and that might be something that you inquire about when you're interested in a clinical trial as well.
Perfect. And then, is there a difference in a pharma-sponsored clinical trial and a clinical trial led by a principal investigator at a regional cancer center?
So again, I don't feel like I have all the information to answer that. From a regulatory standpoint, there should be no difference in terms of what is required to carry out that trial, and in terms of what the requirements will be for the data collection, etc. I'm just not sure if the person is asking if it's a clinical trial that's sponsored by a company and carried out by an investigator at a community center, or if it's an investigator-driven study. But basically what I'm trying to get at is that the standards across the board, it doesn't matter who is driving the study, if it's a company or an academic or community investigator, the standards are the same in terms of how the study will be carried out and what is required in terms of approval levels, etc.
Okay. And for the next one, I'm not sure if you'll know about it. We'll see. When working with First Nations specifically, are clinical trials also required to go through First Nation Research Ethics Board?
You're right. I'm not completely familiar with, for example, the Tri-Council policy statement. I would assume that would also be the case, but I would have to look that one up to get you the correct information. But my assumption is that yes, it would need to be, to make sure it's culturally sensitive and specific and appropriate.
Perfect. And then, how can the results of the clinical trial be accessed?
So again, I think If you're a participant, that should be something that you ask about. It would be best practice if the results do become available, that especially participants know about that. It may take some time after the clinical trial is finished for continued data analysis, and there's always usually some lag time to publication, etc. That's a best practice that at Clinical Trials Ontario we've been trying to instill. So it might take some time before data become available, for example, in a publication, etc. But again, I would encourage you, if you are a participant, to inquire with the clinical trial team about how you can go about accessing the results of the study after the fact.
Okay. And then, do the researchers access medical history of patients to recruit, or is it up to the patient to find the trials?
So I think it can be both ways. It can be up to potential participants to ask, for example, their healthcare providers if they come across a clinical trial they're interested in, or B, if they just want to generally ask about a clinical trial that their healthcare provider might know about. And to answer the second part, healthcare providers may approach their own patients if they know, for example, that a study is ongoing that a person might want to consider. So if they know enough about this individual's case and they know of a study going on, they may ask them if they're interested in participating.
Okay, and then this one, you might know, in Ontario, should there be one REB, re-efficiency and cost?
I don't know if I can completely answer that. I mean, what Clinical Trials Ontario has tried to do is speed up the approval process by working with the research community and having research ethics boards comfortable with other ethics boards reviewing on their behalf and ultimately approving on their behalf. I'm not sure if if the best answer is one research ethics board, or to go with the expertise of the many boards that we have right now and just potentially use their expertise more efficiently than we have maybe in the past.
Perfect. And then, are the clinical trials conducted at a specific regional cancer center recruit patients only from that center, or is it open to all patients in Ontario and Canada?
They can have participants from other areas participating at their center.
And then, sorry, one sec. Just to clarify, so for most clinical trials, the patient usually has to cover everything like flight costs, parking, hotel, food?
It really depends. To Anne-Marie's point, there are some clinical trials where some of those costs will be built in to help participants. For example, with the National Institutes of Health in the US, they will often have clinical trials where they will provide the travel expenses for participants, because those participants will often be coming from all over the world. So it really depends on the study in terms of what costs will be covered or not covered.
Okay. And then, if clinical trials fail, what happens to the patients?
So for example, if a study doesn't reach the endpoints that that the researchers or the people who designed it were hoping that it would reach, I guess that's the question?
Yeah, I think so.
So what happens to the patients who are participants in that study? I think a variety of different things can happen depending on the study and on the sponsor, etc. So again, that would be another question to be asking when you're considering participating in a study. Sometimes studies will end early as well. Those can be both for positive and negative reasons. So sometimes the indications from the study are that the intervention is working very well and it would not be ethical to continue for the full study. And so the study may wrap up early. In other cases, when there are a lot of side effects or adverse events that were not anticipated, studies will end early in that case as well. So studies don't always go for the full time period that may be anticipated, and that's also because the data are continuously monitored by a data monitoring and safety board, and so they will continuously monitor and decide, if the study will continue or not based on the results that are coming out. And so there are a variety of different scenarios for studies to either end early or to not continue on to other phases. And again, I think that's a question to anticipate and ask when you're considering participating in a study.
Okay. And then how is data reconciliation performed when a trial reaches a milestone?
Sorry, how is data reconciliation performed? I'm a little confused what that means. Maybe that's another one I can take offline, Kimberly?
Sounds good.
Okay.
And then someone asked for Anne-Marie, would you recommend clinical trials to everyone, or is it a patient-specific decision? It seems that participation in clinical trials needs to be self-driven since many doctors do not appear to have a lot of knowledge.
So I would say that it is an individual choice. I would, because not everything is good for everyone. So I would say, discuss with your medical professional, because it's true, they don't know everything, and they're busy and they can't access, information as readily as necessarily as we can, considering it's our job to, it's basically our job as an individual to take care of ourselves. So I happen to be in that situation where my physician didn't know about a particular trial or drug. And it happened within sort of the confines of the GTA area. We have two excellent hospitals that you would think that they would know everything, but they don't, and it's just human nature. So I would say do your due diligence, do your research, and present what you have found to your physician and ask questions. Always ask questions until you get the answers that you think are good for you. But I would have to say that I would recommend them in general, but I would say it's an individual choice.
Perfect. Thank you, Anne-Marie. So that's it for the questions. So we're going to end there. And I just want to thank again everyone for the questions and the help.